Well, Dr. David Johnson, thank you so much for convening with me online here to chat through Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, but I'm sure this will take us in other places in the Bible. Before we jump in here, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do there at Providence.
Well, I've been at Providence for 30 years. Came to teach New Testament and Greek, and eventually became an administrator, and now they made me president about 8.5 years ago. So, and I'm coming down to my last couple months here, and then I'm retiring from the presidency, and I'll do some other things too. But I'll be out of the presidency come the end of June. Yeah, and we've been in Steinbeck for 30 years and gone to Emmanuel for 30 years, and we have 3 daughters, and they're all married and have they're raising our 8 grandchildren. So
that's awesome.
So that's me. Yeah.
And if I'm correct, at one point in time, you were the transitioning pastor of Emmanuel back in the day.
I was, and we're going to be talking about Romans 13 here, and I actually preached through Romans in that period of time. While I was the interim pastor for about 14 months. I was pastoring, yeah, and I was a pastor before I did my doctoral studies for 7 years. I've taught Romans in that original pastorate. I taught Romans when I was at Emmanuel. I've done Sunday school classes on Romans and taught Romans here at Providence off and on for a number of years. I went to Ukraine with Jim Scobie and taught Romans there. And then I also taught Romans when we were 3 years ago when we were in Myanmar. Barb and I were in Myanmar. And I taught Romans to a number of pastors there. So yeah, I love Romans. I think it's a great book, and it's had a huge influence on the church around the world.
Well, I'm definitely in agreement with you there, and I think even right now it's a very appropriate book for us to look at in certain pieces of it. So why don't we jump in a little bit just to the background, maybe just a little bit, or give us a little bit of a relevant background to the book, any context pieces that you feel are important for us to know.
Sure. And there's a fellow named Scott McKnight who was a teacher of mine, and maybe you've heard of him back in when I was in doctoral studies. And he's recently released a book entitled "Reading Romans Backwards." It's really a good book, and I agree with his conclusions. He starts with his conclusions and then goes to the front of the book, and so I think what he says is basically the book of Romans is a book that's dealing with unity in the church between Jews and Gentiles. Right. What happened, it's and this is pretty well documented, I think, and most scholars agree, that Claudius was the emperor in Rome at a particular time before Paul ever went to Rome. Claudius was the emperor there, and he kicked the Jews out of Rome. And Suetonius, an ancient historian, said the reason he kicked them out was because they were worshiping Christus, which could refer to Christ. So these would have been Christian Jews, and Priscilla and Aquila were a couple of those people, and the Book of Acts talks about this a little bit as well. So the Jews left, and in the meantime, while the Jews were out, there were Christians in Rome of Roman descent who were Romans. And they established churches, and the church grew, and they were a sort of middle class kind of people, and the Jews were separatists a little bit, and probably a little bit more of the zealot kind of. This is McKnight's view, more of the zealot kind of people. So when they came back together, there was a lot of tension between the Romans who looked down on the Jews because they were Romans, we're Romans, we look down on everybody. And then the Jews looked down on the Romans, especially the Roman Christians, because they weren't keeping the law. So Paul writes the book of Romans for that purpose as a pastor. But he also wrote as a missionary. So he was planning to go to Spain. That's what chapter 15 tells us. He was planning to go to Spain. And so he wrote this book of Romans to sort of put his gospel out there for the Roman Church, because Rome would have been the I don't know how you would put it, the stopping off point before he went to Spain. So he was his plan was to leave, to go to Jerusalem. After he wrote Romans, he was going to go to Jerusalem and make an offering there for the Gentiles, or from the Gentiles for the poor Jews in Rome, or in Jerusalem, because there was a famine taking place, and he wanted to support them. And then his plan was to go to Rome after that, and he talks about this in the book of Acts, or in Romans 15. That was his plan, and he knew from there he was going to go on to Spain, and so he needed a home base kind of thing closer to Spain, and so he was going to do that in Rome. And so he sent the letter by Phoebe. She would have been the sort of the interpreter, reader of the letter, right. So that's the background essentially. So what Paul is doing in the book of Romans is, on the one hand, he's talking about his missionary activities, and then he's also talking about the gospel. What is the gospel that he's going to share when he goes as a missionary? And then he's working at creating unity in the church as a pastor. It's got a pastoral function as well. So that's the context of the book, I think, is the context of the book. There's a lot of debate about it, but I'm pretty sure that's the context of the book.
Yeah. Thank you for that background. That is very, very helpful. So maybe going from that bigger picture there of the political times, some of the backdrop, Paul's journeys, his letter writing, staging point in Spain, all this stuff, sort of diving a little bit into chapter 13, what are we being led into here as we come into this chapter?
I think what Paul has done is he has, if you trace the argument of Romans after the introduction in the first 17 verses, then he talks about sin and the nature of sin, and basically says everybody's a sinner, Jew and Gentile, we're all sinners. Right. Then in chapter 3 and verses 21 to 26, he has this dense theological section that talks about what Christ has done, what God has done in Christ, how he paid for our sins and so forth. And then he spends chapter 4 talking about faith, on what role faith plays. And then in chapter 5, he switches gears, you might say. He switches his style and all sorts of things. And basically, he moves from the courtroom to the living room and says, as a result of justification, we now have reconciliation with God. And that is, we have a relationship with God. And out of that relationship, we live our Christian lives. Then he spends time talking about Israel and the church in chapters 9 through 11, because he's trying to show that God is faithful to his plan. That's what Romans 9 through 11 is about, is sort of laying out how God has been faithful all the way through. And this is sort of the church is sort of the culmination of God's plan. And then in chapter 12, he starts what some people would call the practical section, the command section, and what he's doing there, he's talking about how Christians are to reflect the faithfulness of God. And he starts by saying we're to be faithful to God in Romans 12, 1 and 2. And then in verses 3 through about verse 16, he says we need to be faithful in the church. And then in verse 17, he says just as chapter 12, we need to be faithful in society. He says in chapter 12 and verse 17, repay no one for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Never take vengeance, leave the vengeance to God. And then it concludes that chapter by saying, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's in verse 21. And then he goes into this section on government. So it's pretty natural for him to talk about living in the world. How do we live in the world? And then in that context, government was huge. Yes. The emperor and all the rest were huge, and so he says, then this is how you should be faithful in the context of the government and what's going on with governance in the world. Yeah.
maybe articulate a little bit, what was the relationship between the Christians in Rome and the government itself? You talked a little bit about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles and Romans and Gentiles, but what was their outlook on the government itself?
Well, that's that's interesting to try to suss that out of the text. Certainly, what Paul is saying in this text is that we ought to submit to the government, and the word submit we don't want to take that as we don't want to make that too strong. Sometimes we do that and we say it's all about obedience, but submission is actually about respect, and ordering yourself. I mean, literally, the word hupotasso is to order yourself under somebody, and so it's a matter of respect. So that's one of the first things he says, and then he says, make sure you pay your taxes. That's important too. Pay taxes, and then he has different kinds of taxes here in verse 7. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed. And then my translation, I'm reading the English Standard Version, says respect to whom respect is owed and honor to whom honor is owed. And the word honor there is probably another word for tax. It's a different kind of, so there's different kinds of taxes here. The word respect, interestingly, is actually the word fear. And that's not used of taxes ever. And so it basically says fear to whom fear is due. Now, Caesar operated on the basis of fear. In fact, that's what he wanted. He wanted people to fear him. And Paul is saying, so fear the one to whom fear is due. As a Christian, we don't fear the emperor; we fear God. And so I think this is sort of a subtle, backhanded way of saying, there's a limit to this, all the things that are going on, all the things that I'm saying here. You're to fear God. You're to honor the emperor. You're to pay the taxes and live as a good citizen. But you need to actually fear God. And Peter does the exact same thing in chapter 3. He talks about fear, and it's pretty obvious, I think, in Peter that he's talking about fearing God and honoring and obeying and so forth the emperor, submitting to the government, but fear God. And we need to keep that in mind as we live our lives. That there is a I mean, the way Paul ends this chapter is pretty interesting because he's talking about the second coming, and Christ is coming again, and that is that's the key to it all. So while we're living our lives, how are we supposed to live? Paul, I think, is saying, live your lives in such a way. I'm getting off into something here that I wanted to talk about, but live your lives in such a way that you are looked upon as good. In fact, he says that up in 13 and verse, where is it here? Verse 3. I'll just read the whole verse. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive. My translation has approval there, but it says praise. And praise was a term used back then to talk about honor. And so what Paul seems to be saying is that as we live our lives, we're to live honorably with regard to the government. We're actually, the word honor is connected to the whole social system of that day, which had to do with shame and honor, basically. And so when someone, when a mayor of a city, or somebody who wanted to be the mayor of the city, wanted to be elected, what he would do is he would do something honorable for the city. So he would pave the road, something like that. In fact, there's a stone that has an, I can't remember the guy's name now, but it's related to somebody in the Bible, I think, in the book of Acts. And Erastus, that's his name. And it talks about Erastus who paved this road. He was a Christian.
Okay. Yeah.
He paved this road for the people, and that would bring him honor. And so what Paul is saying is do things that are honorable for society, and that's how we're to live. And the idea, I think, is that's how we live our lives, and that's not just live our lives, but that's how we witness to the world, is to do honorable things for society.
Yeah. I want to circle around to this idea in a few minutes, but before we do sort of talk a little bit about what that looks like practically, one of the things that you had mentioned in our email correspondence was just the idea that maybe there's different ways to look at this passage, or maybe there isn't necessarily a right interpretation. Having sort of looked at this over time, what different kinds of interpretations have you seen, and what's sort of the nuance to that, or the watershed of some of those interpretations?
Right. Yeah. I think maybe I misspoke in the email, because I didn't mean to say there was no right interpretation. I was meant to say my interpretation is not necessarily right.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
More what I said. That's more what I meant. Yeah. But this passage is interpreted in all sorts of different ways because of the social situation that people find themselves in. So when I was in Ukraine, it was 1993. The Berlin Wall had come down in 1990. What was called perestroika was in place, and there was this opening up of the nation of Russia, or the USSR, and the breakdown of the USSR and all the rest. And those people had a particular view of this passage because of their situation in life. They had been under a regime, and I remember speaking there, and it was warm. It was hot, in fact, at times, and we would go into a room and a classroom, and they would all close the door, because they were used to doing that, because they didn't want anybody to hear what was going on, because it was against the law what they were doing up until that time. And I would go and I would open the door because it was so hot in the room, and they would, then we'd go out and we'd come back in and they would shut the door again. So it depends on your situation in life sometimes how you interpret a text. So when I was in Myanmar, the people that I was with were being persecuted by the government.
Yeah.
And they would read this in a very different way. In fact, they had some really hard questions to answer about this. Well, what about when we're being persecuted? Are we supposed to, honor the government and all the rest?
Yep. And there's been a 50-year civil war happening within Myanmar, or Burma, however you term that, as well. So I can see that's a huge pressing issue for them.
Yeah. So basically, I'll say it this way: there's a continuum of interpretations from one end to the other. On the one end, there's this idea of political quietism, just going along and doing, and not getting into trouble and doing that. And then there's this subversive thing that I talked about, Paul's little dig at the emperor by saying, "Fear to whom fear is due." It's God who we fear. And that there's always this all the interpretations fall in that continuum. So some people are saying, "No, we just go along with whatever's happening in society and in the government," and the other people are saying, "No, we're there to subvert the government." And I think it's somewhere in the middle. And the whole idea of witness is the key. That's the point of this passage, which there's a thing in a way of living and operating in the ancient world, in the ancient Roman world. And we call them today household codes. And these household codes dealt with things like, you find them in the New Testament, in Ephesians and Colossians and 1 Peter. and here in Romans as well. And they deal with things like husbands and wives, and parents and children, and slaves and masters, and government. I mean, how people relate to the government, and the emperor was actually called the father of the household, and so Rome, the Roman Empire was considered to be a household, and the emperor was considered to be a father, and so that's kind of what's going on here. And Christians are told how to. I mean, Paul is telling Christians how to live in this household, and the function of a household code was as I said earlier, was as a witness. So when a philosopher like Pythagoras put out a household code, or even Aristotle, he was one of the first ones who put out a household code. What he's trying to do is get people to follow his philosophy, and so as Paul uses a household code, he's wanting to get the outsiders to follow that philosophy, and so it becomes a witness. So our relationship, I think, in the end, our relationship with the government is a witness to the world. It's Paul's means of Paul's means of evangelism, how we relate to the government, and so this term "good" is really important. To practice that which is good in society, where we become benefactors, as it were, of society. Just like the guy who paved the road, Erastus, who paved that road. That's the kind of attitude we want people to have toward us as believers.
Mm-hmm. One of the other sort of things I'd mentioned to you in our email was the correlation between some other passages in the New Testament. And so we have a 1 Timothy 2, 1-2 passage that talks a bit about governing authorities. We have a 1 Peter 2, 13-17 that also has a similar tone or a similar echo throughout all of these different people and occasions. Do you see correlation there, or is there?
They're both of those passages are household codes, and okay. I mean they're part of household codes. So yeah, I mean there's a definite correlation. There's a full, I would say there's a theology of human government in the scriptures that we need to explore, and people have explored that. But some of it goes back to Jesus when he's confronted by the Pharisees, and he says, "Should we pay taxes or not?" Of course, that's what Paul is talking about here too, and in fact, Paul may have gotten his ideas about this from Jesus himself. And what did Jesus say? He said, "Show me a coin, and whose image is on it." And he says, "So give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God." And of course, we are in God's image, so we are to give ourselves to God. So yeah, I think there's lots of passages. I think the whole book of Revelation, not the whole book, but large parts of the book of Revelation are about how we relate to the government. When you think of the beast and so forth, and the context of Revelation, and there's lots of places like that. The book of Acts, to some degree, is about the government, and what Luke does in the book of Acts is he shows how the government was actually, put it this way, theologically, God used human government to further the gospel. That's pretty clear, because Paul's a Roman citizen, and he uses his citizenship to get the gospel to Rome. Otherwise he would have to pay for the trip himself. But here the emperor is paying for this trip for him to take the boat to Rome, and so he's using government. God is using government to further his purposes, and in Luke, I mean, if Luke wrote Luke and Acts together, in the Gospel of Luke, it all starts out that way, because in the Christmas story, it talks about the fact that Caesar Augustus had declared that all the world should be enrolled, and that's how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. If that decree of Caesar hadn't happened, Jesus wouldn't have been born in Bethlehem. So God manipulates human government, and that's what Proverbs says too. That the king is in the Lord's hands, and the Lord will move him whichever way He wants. We need to take account of the fact, and that's what Paul says here too in chapter 13. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God."
Mm-hmm.
So there's this idea that government is a pawn in God's hands. Much as government leaders would disagree with that,
Right.
mayors
Right.
and presidents, especially former presidents, probably would have
Right.
agreed.
Yeah.
Would have disagreed with
Yeah.
that. What do you mean a pawn in
Right.
God's hands? Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, how do we know when we've gone, I guess, too far in our interpretation of this passage? And I ask that in light of right now, the current times we live in, sort of like this, the beginnings of Luke that you talked about. The government is sort of flexing its muscles a little bit more than it usually does, and being a bit more clear on how the church should operate, what its methodology looks like a little bit. Just like Caesar declaring a census to happen, and now all of a sudden all these people are moving back to their original homelands from who knows where, and that is just like it's huge migration happening all over the land. How do we know we've gone too far? How do we know we're going outside of sort of the boundaries of what's being talked about here in this passage?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can know that. I think
Okay.
we can know. I think we can know that we are following the passage.
Okay.
By our attitude, I think that's a large part of it. But I don't know if we can say, because when Paul gets into these sections of Romans or of his letters, the practical sections, he's dealing with particular situations, and we have to take principles out of that. And the principle here, as I said, and Paul's pretty explicit on what the principle is do good. And in the whole section here, he's talking about selflessness. He's talking about not putting yourself first. That has to do with God. That has to do with the church. That has to do with society. Don't put yourself first. Don't think about me first. Think about the public good, and think about what God wants us to do. In the sense of being a witness. Is this the best witness I can be, or am I just doing this to further my own agenda, or am I furthering God's agenda? So the principles, I think, are pretty clear, but the particular applications are not always clear. Even in the book of Acts, there's times when Paul would stand up to the government, and Jesus and John the Baptist would stand up to the government. There's other times when Jesus would say, "Well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's." So one of the things.
Yep.
Let me pick up on that just a second.
Sure.
One of the things that Scott McKnight says in his book is that these zealot Jews who had been kicked out of Rome and then were back were actually anti-Roman, and that's why he writes about paying taxes, because they didn't want to pay taxes. That was and so he's telling them, look, pay your taxes. These people need to get paid, and they're doing things for you. They're making the roads, and so pay your taxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that has come up recently is just the idea that, that's great for Paul to talk about this passage, in the first century, and his government that he had to sort of honor and submit to was very different than the government that we have to today. And so the context doesn't fit our situation. And so this passage doesn't fit our situation. Like, how would you commentate to that?
I would say, well, if that's true, then none of the New Testament applies, because it was all written in a different world and at a different time and with different, So my comment, I guess, the way I would look at it is that we need to figure out what the point is, what the main point is, the main principle that Paul is trying to convey, and then we need to live according to that. And he's pretty clear in that principle, and the principle is do what is good. So I think we need to discern the intention of the text, more so than all of the little details of
all the little details along the
Yep.
way.
Yep. Yeah. And actually, as I thought about that question a little bit too, I mean, one specific thing I was just pondering about is just the fact that Jesus talks so much to the Pharisees, who is this class of religious leaders in his day, but we don't necessarily have a Pharisaic class anymore walking around. They're not governed by a Sanhedrin or anything these days. And so you can't render everything that Jesus said or every parable that he said, because he said a lot of things to the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and the Herodians, just because they don't exist, today. So so maybe just a further thought to that.
I think we'd have to be careful with that, though. I think we'd have to be careful with that, though, because Luke is not writing to Pharisees. Jesus was speaking to Pharisees, but Luke is trying to draw a principle out of Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees, and we need to adopt that principle. For instance, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees about the man who was healed, the passage that Kent preached 2 weeks ago, I think, and we have to say, how do we get that out of? Or maybe it was last week. That was last week. What's the principle out of that? And the principle is that Jesus has come to establish a community that invites sinners. God eats with sinners. It's amazing. God eats with sinners, and that's the kind of idea we need to draw out of there, out of those texts. Not so much what is he saying about Pharisees and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is there? And maybe this is probably the most controversial question I think that people are sort of asking right now: is there a moment, or is there a time, or is there a place where we do resist? How do we know? There was a moment with Paul there where the ruling class there was telling him that you shall not preach the gospel in this particular region, and he went ahead anyways, and the consequences was he was imprisoned. Is there ever a time where we resist? And then if there is, what does that resistance look like? Because as we were talking about that spectrum, some would say, well, maybe resistance looks like filing lawsuits against the government, or maybe even taking up arms, like maybe a violent reaction to government, or a violent resistance to government is probably the better word. Is there a time to resist? And then if so, what does it look like for the church or the Christian to resist? Yeah,
right. Yeah, that's a toughie. That's because of the present situation, because of what happened on June 6th or January 6th and so forth. We just think about all these things, and is there a time to resist? And I think as you said that question, I thought about this a little bit ahead of time, but I've changed my answer since you talked since you asked the question just now. But I think on the one hand, we should always resist. I mean, we should always be resisting anything that is not the kingdom of God. And present day government is not the kingdom of God. So Paul says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And what he's talking about this age. He's talking about the whole thing. We need in one sense to always be resisting anything that's not the kingdom of God, we're to be resisting. But the question, and you put it really well in asking, well, then how do we do it? And I think generally in the Bible, resistance is always subversive. It's not outright. I don't find that kind of rebellion outright, but I find it subversively. So you look at Daniel. That's a perfect example. Daniel was subversive. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Do this," and he said, whoever it was, said, "You have to eat this food and do this," and Daniel said, "Well, now wait a minute. Let's think about this a little bit and see if we can compromise on this." And And there was this subversive idea in Daniel to resist, but to resist in a way that becomes a witness. And and I would say the same thing for Paul. I mean, he there was some resistance there when they were going to beat him, and he said, "Look, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do this to me." And so he was putting up a resistance. And when you read in the book of Revelation, you read how the martyrs resisted the government and by praying and so forth. And Jesus and John the Baptist, John the Baptist lost his head because he resisted Herod. And so we always resist, but how we resist is important. And I think we should always resist with the view of being attractive, living a life that is, and Paul uses the term good, living a good life is probably the best way for us to resist the powers of government and to show the government and to show the citizens of a community. Christians are living that much higher in terms of their values and so forth.
Yeah. I think what I personally find remarkable about the story of Daniel is that he resisted, like you said, he resisted a Babylonian charge to bow down to this particular god, and he resisted doing that. And many during this season of life have pointed to that in terms of the spirit of what he was trying to do there. But then he went on to serve in high levels of Babylonian government the rest of his life. And you never once saw him disrespect, judge, insult any of the Babylonians or the government thereof. In fact, he peacefully resisted, but yet he also respected and continued to make that what his life was about the rest of his days there. So I found that really interesting.
Same with the story of Joseph. I mean, Joseph in Egypt, the same sort of thing. So I think there's a thread throughout Scripture that what you would call a theology of human government. How do we think about human government biblically? And generally, what we find is there's always this resistance to the government, but at the same time, it's a resistance that brings about a witness. So another one would be the book of Ephesians, where Paul says at the end of Ephesians, put on the armor of God because you need to resist the devil and the principalities and powers. Well, those words, principalities and powers, are referred to in other places, refer to government leaders. So there's this, but the book of Ephesians is all about witnessing. So this is how we witness. We resist the underlying demonic kinds of forces, and we live good lives. And we pay our taxes, and we do the things that the government is asking us to do.
Yep. Well, I think we've talked through the majority, but I just want to give one last chance. If there's something that you want to tack on to the end here, or even an encouragement, what would that be for you, or maybe just a summation, if it be that?
Yeah, live such good lives among the Gentiles that. Well, how does Peter put it? Let me just read that again.
Yeah.
But he does say, "Live such good lives among the Gentiles." No, let's see if I can find it here. Beloved, and this is the perfect passage to end with, I think. Beloved, okay. I urge you, as sojourners and exiles. That's how we relate to the world. We're not a part of this world. We're sojourners. We're exiles. To abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. This is how we live our lives as Christians, as sojourners. We're just camping here. This isn't a real home, and we're to live really good lives while we're here as a witness. That wasn't exactly where I was thinking of. There's another passage that talks about that idea of being a witness as well. So anyway, that's my That would be my conclusion.
Awesome.
How can we demonstrate the goodness of God?
Mm-hmm. Well, David, thank you so much for your time today, and I really appreciate your words of wisdom. And also for anyone who's watching this, thank you so much. We will see you next time.
Okay, good.